Ma'am, please cooperate or we'll have to restrain you, the man in scrubs said firmly, his grip tightening around my arm. My heart thundered in my chest, panic clawing its way up my throat as I tried to pull free. What is this? Why are you doing this to me? I screamed, my voice cracking under the weight of terror. My eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for a familiar face, for him. But Nathaniel wasn't here. Instead, I was surrounded by strangers with blank, unreadable expressions. Their cold hands dragged me from the home I'd shared with my husband, pulling me toward the waiting van like I was some dangerous criminal. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I am 32 years old. Until recently, the greatest tragedy of my life had been losing my father, James Hayes, in a plane crash just a few weeks ago. He was my anchor, my protector, the last piece of family I had left. His sudden death shattered my world. But as the van door slammed shut and I was swallowed by the stench of disinfectant and metal, I realized my nightmare was only just beginning. The ride felt endless. I begged, pleaded, demanded answers. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at me. Only the steady hum of the engine filled the silence. When the van finally stopped, the doors opened to reveal a looming building behind tall fences topped with barbed wire. The sight chilled me to the bone. Inside, the air was sterile, laced with bleach and something faintly sour. The beige walls felt suffocating, as though the place had been deliberately designed to strip the humanity from anyone within it. A tall man in a crisp white coat approached me as I was shoved inside. His expression was calm, too calm. "Mrs. Hayes," he said smoothly, extending a hand I refused to take. "I'm Dr. Paul Reynolds, the director here. You are in a safe place." Safe. The word made bile rise in my throat. What is this place? Why am I here? My voice trembled, but my eyes burned with defiance. His sigh was practiced, as though he had performed this routine countless times. "I understand your confusion, but this is for your own good. Your husband expressed serious concerns about your mental state following your father's death. He's worried about you, Eleanor." At the mention of Nathaniel, my blood ran cold. This wasn't concern. This was betrayal. Only days earlier, I had been standing at my father's funeral, clutching Nathaniel's hand while mourners I barely knew offered hollow condolences. At my side had been Nathaniel's mother, Victoria Hayes, her grip too firm, her smile too sharp, her eyes brimming with false sympathy. Then came the will reading. Cold, clinical. I had learned I was the sole heir to everything my father built. The Hayes fortune, the estate, the empire. Nathaniel had smiled reassuringly, Victoria's expression unreadable. Now I was here, in this asylum, stripped of freedom and dignity. I wasn't allowed to call anyone. I wasn't allowed to leave. They shoved pills into my mouth under watchful eyes, ensuring I swallowed. At first I resisted, but resistance only earned me needles and darker sleep. Soon, my body grew heavy, my thoughts sluggish, my will eroded by the fog of drugs. I woke days or weeks later in a bare room with nothing but a narrow bed and a wheelchair in the corner. No clock, no window, no mirror, just emptiness. I screamed. I pounded my fists against the walls. I demanded answers. And when a nurse entered, she silenced me with a needle. Darkness swallowed me again. When I woke next, I had no sense of how much time had passed. My mouth was dry, my limbs weak, my mind drifting between reality and haze. I was no longer living, merely existing, drugged into submission. Until she appeared. At lunch one day, a woman with sharp, calculating eyes slid her tray next to mine. Her voice was low, steady. "This place isn't just for the mentally ill," she whispered. "People end up here because someone wants them gone." Her name was Lila Monroe, and she might be the only reason I survived. Lila's whisper had been a match struck in the dark. For the first time since they wheeled me through that door, something in me responded, small and stubborn, a tiny flare of hope that refused to be smothered by sedatives or the beige walls. Over the next few days, While the medication kept most of the ward docile and foggy, Lila and I moved like ghosts along the edges of the facility's routines, mapping a route out of the place that had tried to erase me. She was sharper than she looked, thin, with dark hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, eyes that missed nothing. She listened to guard rotations the way some people listen for rain. While others talked about television shows or the weather during the meager recreation periods, Lila watched doors, counted steps between the nurse's station and the back exit, and memorized which cameras were left to loop their footage and which screens a board attendant never bothered to glance at. "You don't want to be loud," she said one afternoon, sliding her tray close enough that our wrists could brush. "You want them to think you're asleep. They always assume the sedated ones are harmless." "How do you know all this?" I asked. My voice felt like a stranger's, thin and rusty from disuse. The sedatives made sentences slippery. My thoughts kept falling through them. She smirked. "Because I've been out and back more times than I care to count. Because I know which staff care and which ones collect paychecks and nothing else. Because sometimes the people who put us here don't clean up as well as they think." When she told me about the maintenance door that wasn't locked, the cameras that ran on an old loop during the graveyard shift, and the lazy timing of the night watch, a strategy began to stitch itself together in my mind. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't foolproof. But it was a plan, and a plan was everything. Lila taught me small things that mattered. How to feign the precise slur of sleep. How to hide the key card she'd filched for me wrapped in a paper napkin. How to move when the hum of the fluorescent lights was the loudest sound in the world. She had a way of moving through the ward like she belonged to its shadows. She knew the rhythm of its indifference and the beats where compassion might surface if you watched for them long enough. The night we chose, the skies were a hard, iron gray, and the rain had stopped hours earlier, leaving the ground slick and reflective. The world outside smelled like possibility. Inside, everything was beige and perfunctory as ever. Lila had created a scene at the nurse's station, an overturned cart, a howl of complaints about broken trays, and then she'd taken a tumble that, if orchestrated badly, would have looked suspiciously clumsy. But she played it with a sincerity that drew the staff like moths. I slipped away with the key card burning a hole through the paper in my pocket. Every step was a small war against my body's memory of sedation. My muscles were jelly, my reactions dulled, but adrenaline is a blunt, effective surgeon. It sewed my limbs back together. I moved through the dim hallway, past the posted schedules, past the doorways where other patients slept, past the camera that nodded at its looped recording. The card worked. A soft electronic chirp, a flash of green, and the maintenance corridor sighed open like an invitation. We ran. That's the only word that fits what happened next. Running that felt like falling forward into uncertain salvation. The backing light from the stairwell painted Lila's face in quick strokes. She looked both younger and older in the half-light, fierce and fragile all at once. When the shouts behind us rose, "Stop!" my lungs learned a new rhythm, 2 parts terror and 1 part necessity. We reached the wall. Tall, imposing, and ugly, the kind of wall meant to cage more than bodies. Lila scrambled to the top, and then reached for me. My fingers slipped. I clawed until the grit dug into my skin, and my palms bled. Everything else narrowed down to the wall and the thin, ragged sound of Lila's voice in my ear. "Go. Don't stop." I vaulted over and hit the ground with a force that knocked the air out of me. For a heartbeat I lay there, panting, feeling the cool night air press against my face like an accusing hand. Then I ran. I don't know how long I ran. My legs were lead at first, then glass, then finally steady enough that I could think in more than single-word commands. The city was not kind to a woman in the clothes of a psychiatric ward. Streetlights threw clean circles of light on puddled asphalt. Windows watched like indifferent witnesses. I kept to alleys, used doorways as shields, and crept like a guilty thing. Lila did not make it far. When I looked back in the thin slice of time I allowed myself, I saw her standing, wide-eyed, as the guards closed in. She held something, maybe a plank, maybe a memory, and swung it with everything she had. The scene shattered any romantic idea I might have had about heroic escapes. It was messy, brutal, and utterly human. The guards converged on her. She looked at me as if saying, with one unspoken, terrible certainty, live. I made it 2 days. 2 days of hiding in rain-slicked doorways, drinking from bottles I'd begged for, scavenging scraps, and smiling politely when needed. The medication was still a haze in my system. My memory felt like a film with frames missing. Each time a car rolled by too slowly, my heart seized. Each passing pair of eyes threatened to pin me to the pavement. I needed help, not only for the practicalities of food and shelter, but because I had been stripped of everything that tethered me to my life: documents, phone, even the name of the bank that held my father's accounts. The Hayes name meant nothing without the paper to back it. And without the paper, they could, and had, made me a ghost. There is one person I thought might be able to help. Marcus Hale. No, that's wrong. The name that kept surfacing in my mind belonged to a man who had been by my father's side at charity dinners and whose voice had always felt like a steadying presence behind crisp collars. He had helped organize the memorials, handled invoices deftly, and, when my father still breathed, had been someone I'd seen across boardroom tables with a kind of respectful distance. The memory of his face, practical, meticulous, brought with it the idea of a lifeline. I found a payphone. The copper box felt archaic in the neon wash of the intersection, but privacy mattered. I rehearsed my lie, an old colleague needing urgent help, and pressed the coin into the slot with trembling fingers. The voice that answered was clipped, crisp, and professional in a way that made my stomach ache. Good morning, Hayes and Partners. How may I direct your call? I said the name that wasn't mine and forced my voice into someone else's timbre. Anna Collins, I told the stranger in the receiver, breath tiny and controlled. I need to speak with Marcus Hale. It's urgent. There was a pause, as if the person on the line was sorting me into a folder that said liar or crazy. I pictured the receptionist's practiced smile and imagined every possible filter through which they could view me. Finally, one moment, please. The waiting felt like hearing a heartbeat in a room full of strangers. When Marcus picked up, his voice was steady, professional, the sort of voice you heard when contracts were signed and reputations balanced on a single sentence. Marcus Hale speaking. I said, truthfully, and without the specifics that might get me traced. I need your help. I can't tell you where I am, but I'm in danger. Please, can you meet me? Alone. There was an audible swallow on the other end. Where are you? I lied again. Ran through safe locations in my head, each more risky than the last, then chose a small park on the edge of the city. Elmwood Park, I said. Tonight at sunset. Why me? He asked finally, and there was that same undercurrent of cautious professionalism. I survived on a truth thin as tissue. You worked with my father, I said. You knew him. Please. It's important. He sighed, and in that breath I heard indecision and concern. All right, I'll be there. When I saw him in the park as the sun sank low and the city exhaled into dusk, I felt a mixture of relief and the ridiculous embarrassment of someone who had been reduced to pleading in a payphone for mercy. He was precisely what I had imagined, hands that had spent a lifetime in paperwork, a face that tilted toward careful analysis rather than easy sympathy. He looked at me the way people look at rain-drenched birds, concerned, unsure whether to reach out. Eleanor. His voice used the name I had given myself, not my real one, and his gaze flickered to my clothes. He was the first person to say my given name since they'd taken me. It felt like a small, healing incision. Yes. My voice wavered. Things happened. I need your help. I can't tell you everything here. Please. Can I come with you? Can I stay somewhere safe? He hesitated, long enough that the chill of the evening bit into me. Then he nodded. There's a small property outside the city I keep when I need to get away. It's quiet. It's safe. Come with me. Safe felt like a forbidden word. I swallowed its sweetness. In the back seat of his car, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar, I let sleep find me for the first time that week without the needle's haze. It was honest sleep, imperfect, tremulous, but mine. The property was modest, a weathered cottage with a stoop and a garden that had been allowed to run wild. Marcus moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had managed other people's problems his whole life. He brought food, a change of clothes, and something that mattered more than all of it, a sense that someone in the world believed me. The next morning, Marcus did what I couldn't have done. He reached into his Rolodex of favors and made a call. He explained, briefly but without theatrics, that a woman who'd worked with one of his late clients was in trouble and needed someone she could trust. He mentioned my father's name in the same breath he mentioned an old friendship. Old loyalty has a way of opening doors. When he returned, he brought a man who had the kind of presence that made you automatically tidy your hands and your thoughts. Tall, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen 1,000 versions of the world's ugly truths, he carried a leather briefcase and the air of someone who spent his life reading between lines. He introduced himself as David Mercer and did not smile. David set the briefcase on the kitchen table and opened it with a kind of professional ceremony. He spread documents, photos, and notes like a surgeon laying out instruments. When he spoke, his voice was even authoritative, a map in syllables. "I've spent the last week pulling threads," he said. "What I've found is not simple, but it's consistent. There are forged documents, expedited court orders, and a payment trail that leads directly to individuals with both motive and opportunity." Motive. I echoed. The word made my chest hurt. David's gaze met mine. Inheritance. Control of the estate. Eliminating a potential obstacle isn't unheard of in the corporate world, especially when the obstacle is grieving, vulnerable, and easily labeled as unstable. Marcus's jaw tightened. "We'll take it to the authorities, once we have what we need. Quietly, efficiently. No mistakes." I sat very still, the weight of the words pressing into me like cold iron. It was one thing to have escaped. It was another to know there were people who had plotted and had the means to take you apart piece by piece. It was both terrible and clarifying. There was no walking back into my old life unaffected. There was only moving forward and making the people who had tried to erase me answer for what they had done. David closed his briefcase and looked at me with a clarity that felt like both balm and blade. "Eleanor," he said, "we're going to build a case. But you must be careful. They've shown they have resources. Don't contact anyone who might be connected to them. No social media, no bank calls. Let us do the talking for now." The plan was fragile and fierce. It would require patience, stealth, and the kind of courage that is not the stuff of movies but of small, relentless acts, keeping a low profile, sleeping with the curtains drawn, answering questions without fracturing. It would mean truth spoken in a courtroom instead of shouted in a hospital corridor. For the first night in weeks, I lay in the small room Marcus had offered and let the silence ease my muscles. Lila's face hovered in my mind, her sacrifice a raw and terrible promise that I must honor. If what I now had a chance to do would make her sacrifice mean anything, then I had to be both careful and unstoppable. Outside, rain returned, soft and steady. Inside, a plan was taking shape, layered and slow, like building a house on a foundation that had been purposely undermined. If they had built lies, we would dismantle them, one paper at a time. And somewhere I knew Nathaniel and Victoria, if they were clever, were already beginning to move. Their arrogance would be their own undoing if we were precise. We had evidence. We had witnesses. We had motive. We had a path if we kept our footing. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the face I would bring into the next room. Not the broken woman they'd left in a beige room, but someone sharpened by the rawness of the betrayal, someone who would not be erased again. For the first time since they'd taken me, that image felt possible. The days that followed blurred into a careful rhythm, each one designed not for comfort, but for survival. Marcus's cottage became both refuge and prison, safe from the outside world, but stifling in its stillness. I spent hours staring out the narrow window at the tangled garden, reminding myself that I was free, though freedom was relative when fear shadowed every movement. David Mercer returned often, always with new folders, new names, and new pieces of the puzzle. His presence filled the small kitchen with a gravity that made it difficult to breathe. He was relentless, dissecting every document, every forged medical record, every court paper Nathaniel and Victoria had used to condemn me. They didn't just commit you, David said one evening, tapping his pen against a forged psychiatrist's note. They built a scaffolding of lies around you. Diagnoses invented. Incidents fabricated. There's even a report claiming you threatened to harm yourself after your father's funeral. That never happened. My voice shook, anger rippling beneath my skin. He nodded. I know. That's why it's useful. A false narrative can be dismantled, but it takes evidence. Fortunately, they left a trail. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the table, brows knitted. Victoria's greed has always been her flaw. She doesn't know when to stop. It makes her sloppy. Hearing her name made my stomach twist. Victoria Hayes, my husband's mother, my supposed confidant after my father's death. I could still remember the way she clasped my hands at the funeral, whispering false comfort while her eyes gleamed with something predatory. And Nathaniel, my husband, the man I once trusted with my life. I replayed our last conversations, searching for signs, for cracks in his facade. His reassurances, his soft words, his careful touch. Lies. All of it, lies. The betrayal burned like acid in my veins. The strategy. David's plan was meticulous. He would quietly gather affidavits from the few staff members at the asylum who had doubts, people willing to speak if they were promised anonymity. He traced bank transfers, large sums funneled into accounts linked to Victoria's business associates. He even uncovered correspondence between Nathaniel and a corrupt psychiatrist, a man willing to trade ethics for money. Once we have enough, David explained, we'll bring this to a prosecutor. Not a civil case. Criminal. Fraud. Conspiracy. Unlawful imprisonment. This isn't just about clearing your name, Eleanor, it's about justice. The word justice tasted dangerous on my tongue. Could there be justice for what they had done? For the weeks stolen from me? For Lila, who had been dragged back into that asylum because she dared to help me escape? Sometimes I wanted nothing more than to see Nathaniel and Victoria ruined, to watch everything they valued crumble. Other times, all I wanted was silence. To vanish, to leave the wreckage behind, to forget. But forgetting wasn't an option. The warning. One night, Marcus returned from town with his jaw tight and his knuckles white around the steering wheel. They know, he said flatly as he parked. My chest clenched. What do you mean? They know you escaped. They know someone is helping you. Victoria has been asking questions in places she shouldn't even know to look. Nathaniel has filed a statement with the police claiming you're dangerous and unstable. He wants them to drag you back. The words sent ice through my veins. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I was back in that beige room, the walls closing in, the syringe poised above my skin. David remained calm, though his eyes sharpened. This was expected. They'll try to discredit you. But the louder they push, the more desperate they'll appear. We must be ready. Marcus rubbed his temples. Ready or not, they'll come after her. Eleanor can't just hide here forever. I don't intend to, I said suddenly, surprising even myself. My voice was steady, stronger than it had been in weeks. If they want to fight, I'll give them one. The encounter. It happened sooner than I expected. I went into town one afternoon, disguised in a simple coat and scarf, my hair tucked under a cap. Marcus had insisted I shouldn't go, but I needed air, needed to feel like a person again. The market square was bustling, noisy enough that I felt briefly anonymous. I was choosing apples when a voice behind me froze my blood. Eleanor. I turned. Nathaniel stood only a few feet away, immaculate in his tailored coat, his smile as polished as ever. But his eyes, those eyes I had once loved, were cold, calculating. My God, he breathed, as though delighted. You're alive. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? The audacity nearly broke me. He reached for my arm, but I jerked back. Don't touch me. His smile faltered. You don't understand. You're sick, Eleanor. Everything I've done, it's been to protect you. Rage surged through me. Protect me? You locked me away. You drugged me. You tried to erase me. Heads turned. People were listening. Nathaniel's mask slipped only slightly, his jaw tightening, his grip on charm fraying. He leaned closer, his voice low. If you think you can ruin me, you're mistaken. Go back quietly and maybe, you'll be forgiven. Never, I hissed. Before he could respond, Marcus appeared at my side, his hand firm on my shoulder. Is there a problem here? Nathaniel's smile returned, brittle and sharp. Not at all. My wife and I were just having a conversation. I met his gaze with all the hatred I had left. Not your wife. Not anymore. His eyes hardened, and for the first time, I saw the truth stripped bare. Nathaniel wasn't worried. He wasn't grieving. He was afraid. And that fear gave me strength. That night, David spread out new documents on the table. Witness statements, financial trails, medical records. Piece by piece, the net was tightening around Nathaniel and Victoria. They'll try to strike first, David warned. They'll attempt to discredit you before we go public. But we're close, Eleanor. Very close. For the first time since this nightmare began, I believed him. The walls that once trapped me were now crumbling, and soon, it would be their turn to be caged. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm on the horizon, anticipated, feared, and unstoppable. For weeks, David had worked tirelessly, building the case brick by brick until the structure of lies Nathaniel and Victoria had erected could no longer stand. Marcus stayed by my side, steady as bedrock, while I tried to quiet the voices in my head whispering that they would find a way to silence me again. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, a place where countless lives had been weighed and measured. As I walked inside, people stared, some with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with thinly veiled contempt. Nathaniel and Victoria sat across the room, their posture perfect, their expressions serene masks of innocence. Victoria wore a pearl necklace that gleamed under the lights, a symbol of wealth and control. Nathaniel, in his navy suit, looked every inch the concerned husband wronged by circumstance. To the casual observer, they were the victims of a tragic misunderstanding. But I knew the rot beneath the polish. David began with precision, his voice even and sharp as he laid out the evidence. The falsified psychiatric reports, the bribed doctor's testimony, the trail of money transfers leading back to Victoria's accounts. Witness statements from staff at the asylum who had seen me drugged and restrained without cause. Each piece was a stone flung at the fortress Nathaniel and Victoria had built. And each time, I watched their composure falter, subtle at first, then unmistakable. When my turn came, I stood. My knees trembled, but my voice did not. I told the court everything. The funeral, the will, the night they dragged me from my home, the fog of drugs, Lila's sacrifice, the escape. At one point, Nathaniel's attorney objected, calling my account delusional rambling. But the judge silenced him, his eyes narrowing as he gestured for me to continue. I met Nathaniel's gaze then. His eyes burned with hatred, but beneath it was fear, the same fear I had seen at the market. You wanted me erased, I said, my voice clear, ringing through the room, because I stood in the way of your greed. But I am here. I survived. And I will not be silenced again. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The verdict, the trial stretched for days, but the outcome became inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming, the lies too tangled to maintain. When the judge finally delivered his ruling, my breath caught in my throat. Nathaniel and Victoria were found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. The words struck like thunder. Victoria's face drained of color, her mask shattering as she realized she could no longer charm or manipulate her way out. Nathaniel's jaw clenched, his fists tightening on the table as though sheer force of will could undo what had been done. But it was over. Lila's fate. After the trial, David approached me quietly. There's something you should know. He handed me a letter. It was from Lila. She had written it from within the asylum, smuggling it out through a sympathetic nurse who later contacted David. Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means you made it. Good. Don't waste your freedom. Don't let them win. Even if I never get out, at least I'll know I helped someone else escape. Tears blurred the words, but my heart swelled with both grief and gratitude. Lila might never walk free, but her bravery had given me mine. I vowed, silently and fiercely, that I would fight for her release too. Reclamation. Months later, I stood in my father's study once again. Dust had gathered on the shelves, but the room was unchanged. His scent of old books and cedar still lingered. For the first time, I didn't feel crushed by his absence. Instead, I felt his presence, steady and guiding, as though he had walked this path with me all along. The estate, the fortune, the empire, it was all mine now, legally and rightfully. But more importantly, my name had been restored. My voice had been returned to me. Marcus remained at my side, his quiet support evolving into something deeper, something steady and real. David became more than just an investigator. He became a friend, a mentor, someone who taught me that truth, though fragile, could still win. As for Nathaniel and Victoria, they were nothing but shadows now, two people who had tried to bury me, but instead buried themselves. I walked through the garden, the evening sun spilling gold across the earth, and breathed in the scent of roses. The air was sharp, alive. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a future. Not one defined by fear or betrayal, but one built from strength, resilience, and the unshakable knowledge that I had survived. And survival, I realized, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning.